Anger is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it. It clouds judgment, ruins relationships, damages health, and accomplishes absolutely nothing productive. Yet most people live enslaved by anger, triggered constantly by circumstances, other people's behavior, and events completely outside their control. They believe anger is something that happens to them, an inevitable response to provocation. But the ancient Stoics discovered something revolutionary. Anger is optional. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you create through specific thought patterns and beliefs. And what you create, you can learn to stop creating. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire in the world while facing constant betrayals, incompetence, and frustrations. Yet his private writings reveal a man who had mastered the art of remaining unshaken by circumstances that would drive most people to rage. Epictetus, despite experiencing slavery and physical disability, taught that true freedom comes from being undisturbed by external events. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on anger, calling it temporary madness and arguing that of all the emotions, it's the one we should work hardest to eliminate completely. These men weren't born with supernatural emotional control. They developed it through specific practices, daily disciplines, and philosophical training. They discovered 6 core habits that, when truly mastered, make you essentially immune to anger and being bothered by anyone or anything. Today, we're going to explore these 6 habits in depth. When you internalize them through consistent practice, you'll experience something remarkable. The things that once enraged you will simply lose their power to disturb your peace. The first habit is understanding at a visceral level that people can only act according to their current nature and level of development. This single insight eliminates most anger at its source, because anger requires the belief that people should have acted differently than they did. But the Stoics understood something profound about human behavior. In any given moment, people are doing what makes sense to them based on their current beliefs, emotional state, conditioning, and level of wisdom. They literally cannot act beyond who they currently are. When someone cuts you off in traffic, your immediate interpretation might be, "They're being disrespectful and reckless toward me." This interpretation generates anger because it assumes the person is deliberately targeting you or choosing to be inconsiderate despite knowing better. But the reality is simpler. They're distracted, stressed, running late, or simply a poor driver. They're acting according to their current state, which includes whatever limitations, pressures, and lack of awareness they're experiencing. They're not thinking about you at all. Marcus Aurelius practiced this perspective daily. He would remind himself each morning that he'd encounter people who were meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. But he also reminded himself that these people acted from ignorance of what is truly good. If they knew better, if they had his level of philosophical development and self-awareness, they would act differently. But they don't know better, so they can't act better. This isn't condescension or superiority. It's realistic assessment grounded in understanding human psychology and development. A child cannot perform calculus not because they're choosing not to, but because they haven't developed that capacity yet. Similarly, someone who lacks emotional regulation cannot remain calm under stress, not because they're choosing to be difficult, but because they haven't developed that capacity. When you truly understand this, your anger transforms into something closer to compassion, or at least neutral observation. The practice involves catching yourself when anger arises and asking, given who this person currently is, given their level of development and current state, could they have acted differently in this moment? Usually, the honest answer is no. They acted exactly as their current nature dictated. This realization doesn't mean you accept mistreatment or don't set boundaries. It means you stop being angry about people being who they currently are. You can address behavior calmly while understanding that their behavior reflects their limitations, not a personal attack on you. The second habit is recognizing that anger harms only you and accomplishes nothing useful. Seneca's observation that anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die captures the fundamental irony of this emotion. We experience it as powerful, as doing something, as justified response to wrong. But actually, it's just self-inflicted suffering that leaves the target completely unaffected while devastating us. Think carefully about the mechanics of anger. When you become angry at someone, what actually happens? Your body floods with stress hormones. Your heart rate increases. Your blood pressure rises. Your muscles tense. Your digestion stops. Your immune function decreases. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, shuts down while your amygdala takes over. You literally become stupider and less capable when angry. Meanwhile, your thoughts spiral into obsessive loops, replaying the offense, imagining revenge, rehearsing arguments. Your peace is destroyed. Your focus evaporates. Your mood infects everything else you do. And the person you're angry at, in most cases, they're completely unaffected. They might not even know you're angry. They've moved on with their day while you're suffering intensely. Even if they do know you're angry, your anger might be exactly what they wanted, confirmation that they got to you, that they have power over your emotional state. Your anger gives them satisfaction rather than punishment. Epictetus taught that we harm ourselves far more through our reactions to events than the events themselves harm us. When someone insults you, the insult itself is just words in the air. It has no power to harm you unless you grant it that power through your reaction. But when you react with anger, you've taken something neutral, vibrations of air, and transformed it into hours or days of suffering. You've done the damage to yourself that the other person couldn't do. The Stoics were ruthlessly practical about this calculation. When you understand viscerally that anger damages only you while accomplishing nothing useful, you become motivated to release it. This isn't about being weak or passive. It's about refusing to poison yourself. It's recognizing that if you want to address a problem, anger makes you less effective, not more. Calm rationality solves problems. Anger just creates additional problems. The practice is to notice anger arising and immediately ask, who is suffering from this anger right now? The answer is always you, never them. Then ask, is this anger helping me in any way? Is it solving anything? Or is it just hurting me? When you honestly assess the costs and benefits, you discover anger has no benefits and enormous costs. This realization, repeated enough times, gradually extinguishes anger at its source because you recognize it as pure self-harm disguised as strength. The third habit is separating objective events from your interpretative stories about events. This is perhaps the most transformative psychological tool the Stoics discovered. Epictetus taught that we're not disturbed by events themselves, but by our judgments about events. Between every external circumstance and your emotional response lies an interpretation, a story you're telling about what happened and what it means. And that story is completely within your control. Most people collapse event and interpretation into a single thing. Someone criticizes their work, and they immediately feel angry. But there are actually two distinct things happening. First, someone spoke certain words, the event, and second, you created a story about what those words mean, the interpretation. The story might be, they're saying I'm incompetent, they don't respect me, they're trying to undermine me. This is unfair and unacceptable. Each element of this story is optional and probably inaccurate. The same event could generate completely different stories. You could interpret the criticism as, they're offering feedback from their perspective. They're having a bad day and taking it out on me. They have different standards than I do. They're revealing their own insecurities. When you change the story, the emotional response changes completely. Anger requires a specific type of story, one about unfairness, disrespect, or deliberate harm. When you tell different stories, anger doesn't arise. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. He would examine his disturbing impressions and strip them down to their bare factual components, removing all interpretative overlay. Instead of "my colleague attacked my reputation in that meeting," dramatic story, he'd reduce it to "my colleague spoke words disagreeing with my proposal," bare fact. The bare fact is emotionally neutral and manageable. The dramatic story generates intense anger. The practice involves pausing when anger arises and consciously separating fact from story. Ask, what actually happened, stated as objectively as possible? Then, what story am I telling about what happened? Then, are there other stories I could tell that are equally plausible? Usually, you'll discover multiple interpretations are possible, and many don't generate anger. You can then consciously choose a less inflammatory story, or simply stay with the bare facts without elaborate interpretation. This practice is revolutionary because it reveals that most of what angers you isn't the events themselves, but the dramatic stories you create about those events. When you strip away the story and look at bare facts, you often find something far less anger-worthy than your interpretation suggested. Someone was late to a meeting. That's a fact. Your story that they're disrespecting you and your time is interpretation. Stay with the fact, and anger loses its fuel. The fourth habit is focusing exclusively on what you can control and completely releasing what you cannot. This is the absolute cornerstone of Stoic philosophy, and it's the most direct path to eliminating anger. Most anger arises from wanting reality to be different than it is, wanting people to behave differently than they do, wanting outcomes you don't control to turn out your way. When you become crystal clear about what is and isn't within your control, and you redirect all your energy accordingly, anger becomes unnecessary. Epictetus taught the fundamental dichotomy. Some things are within our control and some things are not. Within our control are our own thoughts, judgments, intentions, and actions. Outside our control is essentially everything else, other people's behavior, outcomes that depend on external factors, circumstances, the past, the future, other people's opinions. The wise person invests psychological energy only in what they control and accepts everything else with philosophical calm. Most anger is directed at things outside your control. You're angry that someone behaved a certain way. Their behavior is outside your control. You're angry about how a situation turned out. The outcome is outside your control. You're angry about something that happened in the past. The past is completely outside your control. All of this anger is essentially you demanding that reality should have been different than it was, which is futile because reality already is what it is. What you do control is how you respond right now. You control whether you continue engaging with someone who treats you poorly. You control whether you address a problem calmly or react with anger. You control what you do next given the current circumstances. You control your own choices and character. When you shift your focus from trying to control the uncontrollable to consciously choosing your response, anger evaporates because you're no longer fighting against reality. The practice is constant vigilance about the control dichotomy. Throughout your day, when frustration or anger arises, immediately ask, what part of this situation is actually within my control? The answer is usually much smaller than your emotional reaction suggests. You can't control that your flight is delayed, but you can control whether you use the unexpected time productively or spend it in angry misery. You can't control that someone was rude to you, but you can control whether you take it personally, how you respond, and whether you allow it to disturb your peace. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. When you focus only on what you control and accept everything else as outside your domain, you stop suffering over vast categories of circumstances that you were never going to change anyway. Your anger was directed at immovable reality, which is why it was futile and self-destructive. Redirecting that energy to what you actually control makes you far more effective while eliminating the anger that came from trying to control the uncontrollable. The fifth habit is practicing negative visualization to build perspective and eliminate disproportionate reactions. The Stoics regularly imagined worst-case scenarios. not to create anxiety, but to prepare mentally and to maintain clear perspective about what actually matters versus what's trivial. When you've contemplated genuine catastrophe, minor frustrations and irritations reveal themselves as too insignificant to warrant anger. Marcus Aurelius regularly contemplated his own death, the deaths of loved ones, the loss of his position and power, and other serious hardships. This wasn't morbid pessimism, it was perspective training. When you've genuinely considered losing your health, losing people you love, or facing genuine hardship, someone's rudeness or a minor inconvenience simply doesn't register as significant enough to generate anger. You've calibrated your emotional responses to match actual importance. Most people react with disproportionate anger to minor frustrations because they've never contemplated what real problems look like. Traffic delay triggers rage because they've never seriously considered being in an accident that leaves them unable to drive. A colleague's criticism triggers fury because they've never contemplated being unemployed or facing genuine professional catastrophe. A partner's minor annoyance triggers argument because they've never seriously imagined losing that partner. The practice involves regular contemplation of what genuine difficulty would look like. Spend time imagining serious illness, significant loss, real hardship. Not to make yourself anxious, but to gain accurate perspective. When you've sat with the possibility of genuinely terrible outcomes, you develop immunity to being bothered by trivial frustrations. Your emotional responses become calibrated to actual importance rather than to whatever happens to trigger you in the moment. Also practice the in 1 year test. When something bothers you, ask, will this matter at all in 1 year? If not, and most things won't, why are you giving it emotional energy now? Why are you allowing something that won't matter next week to ruin today? This temporal perspective helps you distinguish between genuine problems that deserve your attention and trivial irritations that deserve to be ignored. Seneca practiced this by occasionally living as if he'd lost everything, eating simple food, sleeping on a hard floor, wearing plain clothes. This voluntary discomfort served multiple purposes, but one was perspective. When you've experienced, even voluntarily, genuine discomfort, comfort becomes appreciated rather than demanded, and minor inconveniences don't trigger anger. The sixth habit is acting according to your values regardless of your emotional state. This final habit is crucial because many people believe they must feel differently before they can act differently. I'll address that calmly once I'm not angry. I'll handle that situation better when I feel more patient. But the Stoics understood this is backwards. You act according to your principles and values regardless of what you're feeling, and appropriate feelings often follow action rather than preceding it. Epictetus taught that while we can't always control our initial emotional reactions, we absolutely control our actions. Anger might arise automatically in certain situations. That's a physiological response. But you control whether you act from that anger or whether you pause, examine it, and choose a response aligned with your values instead. You can feel angry while speaking calmly. You can notice rage while maintaining dignified composure. You can experience the emotion without letting it dictate your behavior. This distinction is empowering because it means you're never at the mercy of your emotions. You might feel angry, but you can still act with patience, fairness, and rationality. You might feel bothered, but you can still maintain your peace and effectiveness. The emotion is just whether passing through your psychological landscape. It doesn't have to determine your actions. The practice is identifying your core values and commitments, then honoring them regardless of emotional state. If you value patience, you practice patience even when you feel impatient. If you value treating others with respect, you maintain respectful communication even when you feel disrespected. If you value rational problem solving, you address issues calmly even when you feel angry. What's remarkable is that acting according to values despite contrary emotions gradually changes your emotional baseline. When you consistently respond calmly to provocation despite feeling angry, you're training your nervous system that these situations don't require an anger response. Over time, the anger arises less frequently and less intensely because you've broken the reinforcement cycle. You've proven to yourself through action that you can handle these situations without anger, which reduces the automatic emotional response. Marcus Aurelius embodied this completely. He faced countless situations that would justify anger, betrayal, incompetence, ingratitude. But he'd committed to philosophical principles of patience, rationality, and justice. So regardless of what he felt emotionally, he acted according to those principles. Over time, this consistent practice transformed not just his actions but his emotional responses. He became genuinely calm rather than just performing calm while seething internally. These 6 habits work synergistically to create remarkable emotional resilience. When you understand people act according to their nature, you stop taking behavior personally. When you recognize anger only harms you, you're motivated to release it. When you separate facts from stories, you control the narrative that creates anger. When you focus on what you control, you stop fighting futile battles. When you practice negative visualization, you maintain perspective that prevents disproportionate reactions. And when you act according to values regardless of emotion, you break anger's control over your behavior. The result isn't that you become emotionless or passive. You still have preferences and boundaries. You still address problems and stand up for what's right. But you do these things from calm clarity rather than reactive anger. You maintain your peace regardless of others' behavior. You become someone who simply cannot be disturbed by the things that send most people into rage. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca proved this is possible. They faced provocations, hardships, and frustrations that would justify enormous anger. Yet they maintained philosophical calm through consistent practice of these habits. They weren't superhuman. They were disciplined practitioners who applied these principles until they became second nature. You can develop this same mastery. Start with one habit and practice it daily. Perhaps begin with the control dichotomy, constantly sorting what is and isn't within your sphere of influence. Or start with separating facts from stories, catching yourself in angry interpretations. As one habit becomes more natural, layer in another. Over months of consistent practice, you'll notice profound changes. Situations that once enraged you lose their power. You maintain calm in circumstances that disturb others. You discover that your peace is something you maintain internally rather than something others can take from you. This is the Stoic promise. Not that life becomes easier, but that you become unshakable. Not that provocations disappear, but that they lose their power to disturb you. Not that you avoid all anger, but that anger becomes rare, brief, and manageable rather than frequent, intense, and controlling. Master these 6 habits, and you'll achieve what the Stoics considered one of life's greatest accomplishments: freedom from being disturbed by anyone or anything.